with the very latest. Let's cross live now to Sharm El Sheikh, where our correspondent Dave Keating is standing by. Dave, good to have you with us this morning. Berlin is describing this deal as a mix of hope and frustration. Does that just about sum up the response? What exactly has been agreed here?
Yeah, that is indeed the feeling here. Look, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that they agreed this fund that they've been trying to agree for 30 years. They've been trying to get this principle recognized that rich countries who have been industrialized for a century and have been emitting all this carbon are responsible for the effects of climate change that poor countries are experiencing right now through no fault of their own because they have emitted very little carbon. For many years, the developed countries, Japan, the US, the EU, have been resisting this principle, but we finally got an agreement in the early hours of this morning that was acceptable to all parties. Now, the bad news was summed up by EU Vice President Frans Timmermans speaking to the delegates this morning. He said the EU was only signing this deal regretfully, kind of holding its nose, because the EU made an important switch here on Thursday night. They announced that they would no longer stand in the way of this fund, but they had red lines. They said in order for them to agree this fund, all those developing countries need to agree to peak their emissions in 2025. That is, they can continue having emissions rise over the next 3 years, but from 2025 they have to fall, and they also have to agree to phase down fossil fuels. Well, they agreed to neither. So essentially, the EU and the US gave in on this fund without getting anything in return. Now, 80 countries did support the EU's proposal to have language in this text calling for the phase down of all fossil fuels, but that was not enough to get across the line. Many countries, particularly big developing countries like China, India, could not support that language. And Frans Timmermans said basically that there were a lot of worrying developments here because as they were arguing about loss and damage over the past 2 weeks, they made basically no progress on mitigation. They haven't committed to phasing out fossil fuels. The language about the actual mitigation target, that is emissions reduction, is basically unchanged from last year's COP26 in Glasgow. Now, Timmermans said they spent the last 2 weeks basically just trying to stop certain countries from whittling down the 1.5 degree target, that is, keeping global warming to under 1.5 degrees. There were lots of proposals floating around here the last 2 weeks to actually lower that ambition. So, in a way, just keeping the existing Paris Agreement targets intact is a win at this summit. But it doesn't fill you with a lot of hope about the future of this process, particularly when the voices that were trying to water down that 1.5 degree target are the big petro-states, the countries that really produce a lot of fossil fuel, and that includes the United Arab Emirates, which is hosting next year's conference, COP28, in Dubai.
Yes, and already attention is turning to COP28. Dave, Dubai, it's perhaps an unlikely host for a climate change summit. What are people saying about what to expect next year?
Well, NGOs are certainly very worried about this because the UAE doesn't have a very good record of supporting ambitious targets in the climate talks. And of course, it is kind of an awkward setting for hosting next year's COP. I mean, Sharm El Sheikh here in Egypt was awkward enough. Dubai is going to be way more awkward because it is such a major fossil fuel producer. Now, in that loss and damage fund, they've left a lot of the details to work out next year. Basically, they've just agreed on the principle to have a fund, but they left the most contentious bit out, which is who is going to pay into the fund and who is going to draw out from the fund. That will have to be decided next year in Dubai. And they were hoping to get that decided here, but really those talks were going nowhere. The main issue is the US and the EU say China should pay into this fund because it is a rich country. China says, no, we shouldn't because we're a recently rich country and we're not responsible for the emissions over the past century. And in terms of who draws out, the EU and the US want to make sure it's only the most poor, the most vulnerable countries to climate change that can draw out. And you wouldn't want a nightmare scenario where, let's say, China was drawing out of this fund. So that's going to be really tricky next year. do the Emiratis have the ability to garner those compromises? This was already a very difficult year for the Egyptian presidency. A lot of complaints about how they handled this, that they left compromise texts for very, very late, that they didn't put in the legwork in terms of negotiations, and that they were kind of conducting this climate summit half-heartedly. They, after all, have not been a real climate champion in the past, and you could really feel the difference from last year in the UK, in Glasgow. The UK has been quite a climate champion, and you feel the difference in terms of the legwork and the leadership. So not a lot of hope for next year's summit in Dubai, and it may be another summit where they're just trying to keep the existing ambition intact, and there's really no hope of increasing ambition, even though science tells us that we must increase ambition in order to meet that 1.5 degree target. I think a lot will depend where we are next year at this time in terms of the energy crisis and energy prices.
Dave, we'll leave it there. That's our correspondent Dave Keating joining us live from Sharm El Sheikh. Moving on, and authorities in Ukraine